event series. And this is the second one, which is organized by Altınbaş University Center for Social and Economic Research, which is in terms of, in other names, TEAM. And the second speaker of the series is Margaret Raymond, the program director for education research and the director of the Center for Research on Education Outcomes, CREDO, from Stanford University, with her speech entitled, "If Not Now, When? The Opportunities and Cost of Education Reform." So, Meki, if you want, you can start your presentation. We will be very happy to hear you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you this evening for you and this morning for me. Before I start my presentation, I want to apologize in advance. As you can probably see through the window behind me, there is some construction going on where I am. There is construction at my home, there is construction at my office, and there's construction on the road between my home and my office. So there is no place where it's going to be completely quiet. And I apologize if it gets noisy. I can try to get the workers to stop, but let's see if we can proceed with our presentation today. I'm going to share my screen. I do have some slides. I'm going to run through my slides, and then I would be happy to answer any questions that you have or enter into a discussion with you. I'm very interested in getting your views as well today. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see the presentation? Yes? Okay, fantastic. Well, my talk today is about the urgency of education reform. And this is actually a conversation that is occurring across the globe. I'm going to try today to talk to you about how this problem and this opportunity manifest in Turkey. I have to say I've learned a lot in the last month as I've been getting ready for this presentation about the way that the government in Turkey has responded to the current crisis. And I have tried to position the argument that I'm trying to advance today in a Turkish context. I am not an expert on Turkish education, but I'm interested in seeing if the argument that I am making around the world actually fits in your context as well. So let's go. I believe that we are at a unique moment in the development of education policy, not only in Turkey, or the United States, but in many, many countries. And I think the moment calls for not only a time of recognition and reflection, but a time of courage and action. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we knew about education in a general sense before we entered into a period of global pandemic. I'm going to talk about what we know so far about the impact of the pandemic on students and on education outcomes, and talk about why it's so important for us to be talking and acting now to improve the way we organize and deliver education in Turkey, in the United States, and around the world, and talk about some options that we might think about as the vehicles for creating change, and then end my presentation, which is about 25 minutes, with really a call to action for all of us. So I'm going to try to do all of that rather quickly. And want to start with the landscape that existed in Turkey before the pandemic hit in 2020. And I have to say, in doing my researches for this presentation, I learned that Turkey has had a 25-year period of truly improving the way in which it looks at education, the investments that it's made in education, and the policies and practices that it has brought forward to try to increase not only the quantity of schooling in Turkey for students, which started with increases in compulsory education, requiring students to remain in school for 4 more years, starting in 2012, but also starting school earlier. And this is very much a function of understanding that there are windows of development for children. And if you don't grab those windows of development, you're missing an opportunity to create foundational knowledge at a time when it's very easy for children to learn. So we see that you're starting school even earlier in Turkey now. The federal government has increased investments over a fairly long period of time in education. That is both improving the years of schooling, but they're also investing more in the teacher force. And so you're increasing the quality of teachers that you get going into teaching. And we've seen over a long period of time, looking at PISA and other test results, that we can see that there's a positive trend here in literacy rates across the country. And this is an improvement that has immediate effect in the labor force and in the ability of individuals and families to operate effectively in society. This is a 2018 graph that looks at all of the countries that participated in the PISA exams. This is an examination given to 17-year-old students around the world, and it tests what they know in reading and in math and in science. And in 2018, Turkey came in just about in the middle of the pack of all the countries that took the test. What is amazing to me is that if you looked 5 years earlier, Turkey was actually substantially to the right of the red line that you see now. And so what we're seeing here is that Turkey has over time improved, this is math scores that we're looking at, but they have improved the amount of knowledge that students at 17 years old hold, partly because of increases in compulsory education, partly because the quality of instruction throughout the grade spans is improving. We're seeing that Turkey is holding its own against other OECD nations and other nations that use PISA to judge what their students know. These are good results, and they, what I will say is that these average scores that you're looking at now, when you disaggregate them, you do find that there are substantial differences between males and females. There are substantial differences by cultural groups. There are substantial differences by geography. And you, like many other countries, have substantial gaps within your country. As we move into COVID, we already know that there are differences in how much students have been able to learn, have been given opportunity to learn, and have learned going into the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, Turkey was actually extremely well positioned with respect to whether the teachers and the students in Turkey felt that they had their necessary foundations to participate in education with technology as one of the leading vehicles for gaining instruction, gaining access to learning materials, and participating in educational activities. And so what I'm showing you here is 2 years before the pandemic hit, the OECD went around to all the countries that you saw on the slide before and asked them about their teachers. How many of their schools felt like their teachers were well trained in the use of technology, felt competent in using them for instructional purposes, used them on a regular basis to deliver instruction, felt like they needed further development, or reported that they had problems with either getting equipment or getting access through the internet to any of these resources. And in every single one of these categories, as you can see, the proportion of school leaders, principals in Turkey that said they were in good shape is a lot better than we saw as the average of the OECD nations. These numbers are not disaggregated below the country level. So I can't tell you whether the same achievement gaps that we see for students actually apply here to the use of technology. I have to believe they do. When I look at internet availability across the country in Turkey, I see that there are areas that are very challenged in terms of having access. When I see whether there are mobile carrier patterns where cell service is available as the sort of backup service for technology, there are large parts of the country that are not well served. So I think that these actually have the same kind of underlying disparities in how well schools across the country have teachers prepared, but I can't verify that with actual data. And the same story is told here in terms of students and their ability to look at education resources from their homes. This turns out to be a question that was asked earlier because people thought students needed to have access to technology for the purposes of doing homework. We didn't expect in 2018 that home access to technology would become a critical feature for education in terms of the primary mode of instruction during the day. But what you see with these numbers is that 2/3 of the students in Turkey are reported to have a home computer at home. That's obviously a large disparity here when we look at the lowest quartile of students. Only about 1/3 have access to a home computer. But a quiet place to study is strongly reported across the country as a whole, even in the lowest quartile of socioeconomic status. Over 3/4 of the students say yes, they have a quiet place that they are able to use for studying purposes. So access is a problem, but if access isn't the issue, students do report that they are set up to learn, and that's prior to the pandemic. So let's look at what happens when the pandemic hits. I'm probably going to share information that you already know, but just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. You know that the Turkish Radio and Television Corporation has a program called İİBF. I'm not going to try to say that name in Turkish. I can't pronounce it very well, but what they managed to do was to allocate channels on television, 3 different channels, one for elementary school, one for lower secondary, and one for upper secondary. And they use those channels to deliver basically broadcast instruction 7 hours a day for 5 days a week. This is a strong response by a national telecommunications and television organization. When we look across the globe, not very many countries had that kind of response that quickly. It only took 2 weeks for the EBA program to make that pivot and to start delivering instruction. The problem, of course, is that not everybody had access to television and broadcast. There are large areas of the country where that did not happen. The mobile telephone carriers then started to bring the same programming over audio channels. And so there were 3 different audio channels that were available. I can't quite imagine what it would be like for a student to listen to a cell phone for hours and hours and hours every day, but at least it was something that was available to students that they could try to continue with. The other kinds of disparities that are not possible for governments to address still persisted. We do see reports across Turkey that the success of these broadcast and cellular phone instructional resources heavily depended on the ability of families, specifically parents, to support instruction. They essentially became ancillary teachers in the home. And that, of course, means that if the families themselves do not have strong education backgrounds, which is true for a substantial portion of the Turkish adult population today, then they were challenged in their ability to support the learning of their students. We saw that these differences in family capacity broke down by cultural differences, by economic differences, and by gender differences in the same way that we saw the student attainment data break down. This set of factors also drove the ability of families to support learning during the pandemic. We see that there were very specific ways in which students were affected during the pandemic. In many parts of Turkey, students just didn't start school at their regular appointed time. Families just didn't send students to school. They were keeping them at home, waiting them out. Where they did try to get their students involved in schools, many of the communities where early childhood education was originally in place, those services got frayed. Early childhood education was not where the government EBA program put their emphasis. And so early starts were delayed and they were frayed for many students. At the elementary education level, estimates of Turkey are that there were 122 days of closure between January 2020 and May 2021. 122 days is about 3/4 of a year of schooling. And while it means that students were being asked to take their instruction in other ways, this length of time out of the classroom isn't just about delivery of instructional practice. It was also about forming the habits of learning and forming the social understanding of being a student and being a learner. And so this kind of gap, particularly in the early grades of elementary school, is a profound impact on students and their ability to come back into a classroom setting, be ready to absorb learning as the pandemic comes to an end. Students who had already had a few years of learning, either in lower secondary or upper secondary, already had those foundations of learning and those practices of learning embedded. So their ability to recover from that standpoint is not as badly affected. But the trade-off here is that it's reported that those two levels of education had even higher numbers of days where schools were closed in the same time period. So what this suggests is that there are going to be much more delayed learning for the secondary level of learning, that the amount of time that it will take for secondary students to make up for the lost time is longer for both lower and upper secondary school. One of the things that my team at Stanford has been working on for the last year and a half is to try to actually know what specific impact on learning the pandemic has created. And many other organizations around the globe are also trying to do this. My work focuses only on the United States, and so it's really not particularly relevant to our conversation today, only to say that the estimates that we get for the United States are paralleled in the studies that have been done around the world. And so you may know that the World Bank, UNESCO, and United Nations undertook specific studies in countries around the world to try to get a sampling of what happened. And so they were literally going out and trying to find students and giving them the same kinds of tests that they would normally do, and then estimating how much less learning those students had than they would have had 2 years ago, if the same students had been tested. Their methods are a little bit different than ours, but the idea is still the same, that we would have expected students to have a certain amount of learning by this point based on projections of learning or earlier cohorts of students and how much they knew. You know, if a student is exactly like a peer from 2 years ago, what did the peer know and how much does the student today know? That's how you get these gaps. I couldn't find any Turkey specific studies that have been done. If you know some, I'd love to know more about that. But other countries have ranges from a quarter of a year to a full year of learning lost by the end of the 2021 school year. The average loss across all the countries was about 2/3 of a year in both reading and in mathematics. Again, lots of variation, and the variation is really the part that is the most concerning. I will say that in the countries that have these low estimates of 0.25 and so on, these are countries that don't have universal education in the same way that we do in Turkey and that we do in the United States. And so the smaller estimates of learning impacts are because we're talking about an elite subset of the youth population. And those elites who do go to school also are the ones that have the parental supports at home that can support learning. So we're getting the best student estimates in those countries, but it's not representative of the circumstances that folks in Turkey are facing or the folks in the United States or many other countries. Okay, so it's a big deal. We've got huge learning losses, and they are these are average losses. They're even bigger when we start to disaggregate students. And so what does that mean for Turkey? What are the stakes? Well, I'm going to say I'm very anxious, not only for Turkey, but for many other countries, that there is huge pressure to just get back to school. And I want to make the argument today that that rush to return to school is actually extremely challenging and detrimental to the long run interests of not only the students today, but the nation as a whole. If you're rushing back to school, you're only rushing back to the way that we did things before. And I'm going to make the argument that those models no longer fit. They don't fit the context of students coming back. They don't fit the places where students learn. They don't fit the way we need to address students. And we don't actually serve teachers well either with those models. We're asking teachers to come back and pick up with whatever they used to teach. And so they're facing classrooms where students are coming back with much wider points of preparation than they ever saw before. And they're trying to pick up with an instructional point that many students can't even see and move forward. And so teachers are going to be frustrated because they're trying to teach material that the students can't grab onto, and their teaching can't adjust for the kinds of differences that students are facing themselves. Second, in many, many places, we're losing the ability to find out what students know. We have a moment in which we need rigorous understanding of what students are learning, what they know and what they're learning going forward, at the exact same moment that there are lots of pressures that education policymakers face to eliminate the assessments, supposedly because they're not fair, supposedly because they're not universal, supposedly because they will tell a story of disruption that people are too traumatized to hear. I'm going to take that argument and say we've never needed assessments more than we need them now. One of the things we're seeing across the countries that we're involved with, huge exits in teachers from the labor force. Teachers are saying, it's too hard, I'm too burned out, I'm not getting the right supports, I'd love to hear if that's happening in Turkey. In many countries that the World Bank has been tracking and the OECD nations, we're looking at a 30% teacher turnover rate in the next 5 years. 30%. We can't operate our current models with 2/3 of the teachers that we have. So we have to think about ways to do things differently. I'm going to be talking a little bit about work that was done for the OECD by some researchers. This is not my own work, but I think that there's a lot of really important information in this work. So I'm bringing their work forward today. We're having a lot of trouble figuring out what students know today. But if we have good estimates of what they have lost out on, it's possible then to say, if we don't make that up and get back on track, we can take a look at what that will mean for Turkey, for the United States, for every other country on the planet. Across all of the OECD nations, the work of Hanoshek and Wusman suggests that individual students will lose between 6 and 9% of their lifetime earnings. That is a huge hit. And this says, basically, if we don't get them back to where they should be today and move them forward as they would have, 6 to 9%. If we continue to let them languish and we don't accumulate every single year that we let those losses remain and they fall further and further behind, the number goes up. And I've seen estimates as high as 12% of lifetime earnings, depending on how far back the student was. So those groups that we've already said were lower, were underserved before the pandemic, are harder hit with the pandemic. They are even further behind than the average student. Those lifetime earnings go down by a larger proportion. So this is an economic crisis because that translates into a reduction in national gross domestic product of 3 to 4% every year for the next 80 years. These are students who are coming into the labor force. They're going to be in the labor force for a long time. They're going to drag the economy down with them. And those efforts are, those impacts will persist even after they leave the labor force because they will have pulled, it will take another generation to bring back the level of GDP to the level that we saw prior to the pandemic. We're talking 80 years of a loss of 3% or 4% of GDP. Okay, that's dollars in people's pockets, but those losses also have a profound effect. Those learning losses have a profound effect on healthcare. They have a profound effect on public safety, for social stability, and for countries like Turkey to be able to innovate. Because the way that we grow economies isn't by having lots of babies. The way we grow economies is that we innovate and we bring new ideas and new methods of production and new industry to our countries. And if we don't have the knowledge capital to do that, then innovation is depressed. And so all of the things that we hope for in terms of building a vibrant economic society going forward are impacted by the learning losses that we're seeing. Okay, if I have not depressed you entirely, let me try to introduce some optimism here, because I do actually think there are things we can work on. So let me just take a sip and I'll be right back. Okay, I do think that there are paths of solutions, and let me explore those. I'm very excited about this moment because we have an opportunity to really rethink what school looks like. And my team is not only looking at how students are impacted, but we're also moving to thinking about how we might want to rethink the delivery of education. I know there's a huge push to get kids back into classrooms so that parents can go back to work. I'm totally empathetic with that. As I look at the members of my team with young children at home, and I see how much people are struggling, everybody wants kids back in school. I'm good with that. But maybe school doesn't have to be the same thing. So maybe in order to give kids more chances to make up the learning that they've lost, maybe we need to talk about kids going to school all year for the next 5 years, year-round school. Maybe we want to flex so that schools actually don't have the same days off. Maybe we want to think about school being 3 days during the week and on the weekends so that families can be home for 2 days a week to support learning. Maybe we want to have models where, in fact, students don't even show up to schools on some days or for some periods of time. These are ways that we could think about bringing new experiences to students. So on the right picture, this is a school that actually exists on a barge in a delta where students go to the school for 3 months in a year's time. They go and they learn all about science, all about oceanography, all about waterways. They have to use math. They read a lot about the cultural history, the local history, the biology. They're using an entire model on the barge. And apparently the waiting list for this is like 10 times the number of seats that are available. So people are excited about something like that. And I think it can be a spark to the imagination that we could imagine other things. I also think that we could consider the possibility that an entire community gets together and says, in our community, we want people to really understand our world. And so we're going to create curriculum that's out in the community. So 8th graders are going to spend every year, 8th graders are going to spend a month going to school in a particular kind of setting in which they get to see part of how our community works, whether it's working in the restaurant trades, being part of the restaurant and food culture, whether it's looking at what manufacturing is available, looking at tourism. You could imagine an entire array where in 7th grade students do this, in 8th grade students do that, in 9th grade students do that. This could be an entire model of changing the way that we think about the walls of the school and trying to figure out a way to make them much more flexible. I'm also thinking about models where the school actually is a building, but many, many other things happen in the building. Many different kinds of schools could happen. So you could have a school that has got one type of a theme, or you've got a particular school for students who are having challenges with reading. You could have a different school where students are getting a lot of psychological and counseling supports because they need it. You could have an entire school for people who are learning the language for the first time. I'm thinking about the building not being a single model, but having it be a receptacle for lots of different things happening in the school. And I'm excited about the possibilities that introduces. I also think it's a moment for us to think differently about human capital. We have a model, I believe Turkey has the same model, where we have one teacher and 25 or 35 students sitting in front of them, right? And that one teacher is supposed to be the single source of all instructional inspiration for all of those students. I want to break that model up because not all teachers are great at instruction. Not all teachers are great at instruction in every subject. And so the technology piece that we saw come so hard into so much reliant in the pandemic era gives us the opportunity to bring the very best math teacher for 6th graders to a much larger number of students. I mean, I'm imagining what would happen if the nation's best 6th grade math teacher had the opportunity to teach. And teachers in other schools their job would not be to deliver instruction in the awesome and inspiring way that that teacher does. Their job is to support students and understand their students. Where are the hangups? Where are you not getting it? How can I help you figure out what your sticking point is? And maybe there are other teachers whose real job, their brilliance is, I may not be great in moving students super far forward, but what I'm really good at is finding students who are significantly behind and making sure that they understand the joy of learning, making sure they understand that they have the capacity to make progress, that they don't get frustrated, that they are a blend of both coach and teacher and motivator for a large number of students to make up those learning losses. I think that there are lots of teachers whom the pandemic revealed were great at teaching over a remote connection, and other teachers who are not. So we could think about splitting the teacher force by what learning technologies they use. And finally, because we're looking at such a high rate of teacher turnover, I think we have to think differently about who's allowed to be a teacher. This is a huge, huge barrier for getting great people in the classroom. And so I think there's lots of ways we can think differently about teachers. I think we can create new pathways into the teaching profession. I think there are ways that we can encourage people to be teachers, perhaps not forever, perhaps for 5 years or something else. But I think we need to think differently about human capital. And finally, I want to think differently about the way we use digital resources. One of the things I failed to mention earlier is that the EBA program encouraged teachers to share lesson plans. And they got 6,000 lessons contributed in a very short period of time. I think that's a remarkable response from the teacher force. And while I want to celebrate that kind of proactive behavior on the part of teachers, the moment I read that, the question in my mind was, how do we know those are good? How do we know that we're actually making available the very highest quality of instructional materials that are going over the digital channels? And so my suggestion would be, we have an opportunity to create a national repository of really high quality instructional material, not only for teachers to use with their students, but it represents a beautiful model for professional development. So teachers can look at an array of ways of teaching that 6th grade math that I just talked about. We could have 60 units on teaching 6th grade math, and they're all high quality. Well, then teachers anywhere in the country can look at that and they know what high quality instruction looks like. That would be such an incredible asset for all of the teachers across the country. And I don't think the cost of creating that would be very high. So I want to just encourage new ways of thinking about how we make these resources available to folks, and what moment does that present for us to really make a huge leap forward in the quality of instruction and the ability to bring high quality to students. So I'm going to close my remarks here today with really a call to action. Big pressure to get back into school, big pressure to return to models that I would say are not appropriate. We have a limited window. I also understand, I see it everywhere I go in my communities, and I'm hearing about it across the globe. People are exhausted. There's a lot of inertia just because we're all so tired. And so we have a limited window to act, and we've got a low energy level out in the world. We've got to figure out a way to get past that. And the way that I would suggest is we have a much broader range of folks who now understand how critical it is to repair education. And we have a number of new stakeholder groups that are very anxious to have improved education available for students their students, students in their community, students that they ultimately will have to serve because they're a delivery mechanism for other services. We have a coalition right now of the aware population. And I think that that coalition can actually be brought to bear to bring new ideas and new energy and new demands for reform forward in this time period. But keeping momentum is going to be a real big challenge. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm going to drop this so I can be back with you.
So Meki, it's really wonderful to hear Turkey perspective from you. I really like your presentation, and I have too many questions in my mind, not to ask perhaps, but I'm going to make as a research or project in the near future. It's
excellent.
Wonderful, really. I want to speak about you later, but I just want to ask you one question. What about the dropouts? How we can return them? Do you have any suggestion, for example? Because as far as I know, it's a very huge dropout rates in Turkey after COVID, especially for the people who were living in east part of Turkey, and who were, especially the families who were working in the farms, because, you know, as children are the workforce for them. So dropout rate is really huge in Turkey. What do you suggest for them? If you have any suggestions, for example, it will be nice to hear it. Thank you.
So you're touching on a huge sore spot, not only in Turkey, but in many, many other countries. And the way that I think about this is that we need to find a way to work with families, not against families. And so in places like Africa, where children are a huge part of the labor force, in Turkey, in the agricultural communities across the globe, we need to leverage the ability to bring high quality instruction to where the students are. We're not pulling them out of the fields, but we might want to encourage that from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 8 o'clock at night, they can use technology access, whether it's delivered over satellite, whether it's delivered over a television program, that we support families and their priorities, that they have to feed their families, they have the basic needs they must meet, and that we want to, at the same time, bring their students forward so that their students have a future. So my solution is, there are examples of people who take, is minivan a word you use in Turkey? Do you know what a minivan is? It's a small, how about SUV? Do you have an SUV? You know what SUVs are? Okay, a minivan is just a larger SUV. So you take an SUV and you create a satellite link to the SUV, and then the SUV becomes the hub for driving out to wherever the families are. And the students can basically be in the same proximity to that, and they can gain access to digitally based teaching from there. It's not expensive. It's so much less expensive than supporting children who are not educated for their whole lives. So I do think that we can think very creatively about how to address this. And there are places around the world that are already starting to do that work.
So exactly, you are saying that flexible hours and flexible online or face-to-face.
Exactly.
Field working, they can come to their houses and they can work with their families, and after that they can learn something from their houses. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good idea, I guess. And also, I'm going to ask you another question, and I will leave other individuals, researchers, to ask questions to you. And also, you told that, for example, parents can teach some lectures or courses, or, you know, help their children at their houses. But according to that, of course, you should think about that there should be a labor flexibility as well. So labor market should also change according to that, I guess. This is not a question, but this is a, you know, reality. I just want to add about that, I guess. Thank you.
So you're pointing to The coalition that I was talking about at the very end has, of course, to include employers, because they need to understand
Exactly.
the role that they can play in bringing a solution forward for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I just want to point this out. So are there any questions if you want to ask? Okay, Nursal, you can wait a minute. Yes, sorry.
I think, yeah, it's on now. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I really liked it. And also thank you for taking the time to bring in the Turkish perspective, because I mean, you looked into data and research papers, so I really appreciate it. Actually, my question is more like more about the practical applicability of some of these ideas. I really like the new solutions that you propose, especially the idea of moving away from the old way of style of education, like only face-to-face in-class education, and making it more hybrid with, especially I like the idea of, bringing in learning experiences like apprenticeship, or I think that would also be great pedagogically for the kids, and not just being in class, but having hands-on learning experience at some level. I mean, if we solve the issues of, having access to internet by everyone, or having access to technology by everyone to do this online and face-to-face hybrid solution. In Turkey, we have a central administration for education, so it's easier to handle things because there's the same curriculum taught at every school, public or private. That's mandatory. But as far as I remember, in the US, I know financing is decentralized by neighborhood, but also education is quite flexible as far as I remember. So there's not a really strict central administration in terms of, the content. If I'm wrong, please correct it. So I was wondering how applicable it could be in the US context to bring in this kind of new model. I mean, some schools might be happy to adopt it, some might be hesitant. So I don't know if it would end up being a very heterogeneous structure, or, I mean, that's just more like the practical side of it. I like the idea, but I just want to learn more about the US context. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments and your questions. I think the description that you gave of American education is exactly right. We have a patchwork across the country. We have essentially, we have 100,000 different districts. And while our funding mechanisms come from 51 different states, the real decision-making is down at the district level. And states can exert a little bit of pull, but you'd be surprised at how little influence they really have. In smaller states, they're able to have a slightly broader reach, but in a place like California, my own home state, there are 15,000 school districts in California. And they have literally been told by the state, figure it out. Figure it out. So you can imagine that there are going to be some of those districts where they throw their hands up and say, whatever the teachers want to do, that's fine. We'll just do that because we need to hold on to our teachers. And there are others that say, we want to partner with our teachers, but our students really need X, Y, and Z. And so we're going to ask the teachers to modify what they do. And there are some districts that say, you know what, this is a moment for us to completely rethink things. And so in California, we're going to have some very innovative solutions come online, and we're going to have some places where nothing changes. And from a researcher perspective, I ought to be very excited about that because it's a natural experiment and I can go look at all the data. From a citizen and from a consumer perspective, I'm horrified by that. Because I know I have a very strong hunch that there will be districts where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students are going to get left behind. And the districts will say, oh, we tried, right? I'm much more encouraged in a place like Turkey, where there can be a very rational way of thinking about this, of potentially offering the opportunity for small area experiments, right? Where you could say, I'm interested in getting 40 elementary schools to think about school on a barge, or the equivalent of that in your community, right? 40 schools across the country. Let's try that for 2 years and see what it looks like, right? You've got the opportunity to set that up in a really careful and deliberate way that we can learn from, that we just don't have in the United States. So I'm encouraging you to go forth and encourage this kind of innovation and experimentation, because I do think it's really, you have a much better opportunity than we do.
Thank you, Nursal. Is there any question? So if there's not, I will ask another question, Meki. As you know that there are some cultural things in Turkey, and people, especially some of the families, want girls to stay at home. So if I'm asking, what do you think about that? If we made as a national education, if we change the education system, and then if it is more flexible to stay at home and work at home, at online, etc. So what will happen? I'm really confused about that, and I'm really wondering about those families' children, because especially those parents wants girls to stay at home. Oh, they can say that, okay, stay at home and not face to face, just online, if we, let them. So what do you suggest, if you have any suggestion about that? Because I really I like the ideas, but there will be some problems, especially in our country, I guess. If you got my point.
I'm listening very carefully to your question, and I'm also hearing the question behind the question.
Yeah. So this is the question. I am also wondering what will happen if those families will want them to stay at home. So how we can, make them not to make those girls to stay at home.
So let's separate stay at home from educating at home. Because in the past, stay at home meant I don't want my daughter to be educated. The Turkish government has already spoken about that. You have compulsory education. And so while there could be flexibility in where students do their learning, there's no change in the requirement that students should learn. And so my expectation here is that there could be really strong online communities that support the learning of girls whose cultural background is more domestic in focus, but still want the students to have the same opportunities for learning, regardless of where they sit. So I'm thinking, I don't know what the cultural perspectives are on allowing girls at home to connect with other girls who are also at home, but I can immediately see community there that could be very supportive to the idea that you can still learn, you can still advance in your knowledge, you can still gain perspectives, you can still improve your cognitive capital, even if you're sitting at home.
So you said that at least they are learning.
Well, I believe that there's an opportunity for that to happen. I don't know enough about whether the culture is literally, I want my girls behind closed doors, or whether the culture is, I don't want my girls to know anything.
Okay, I got it.
So
okay.
I need help with that.
Okay. So is there any question? So any
Thanks.
is coming, but I don't know. Okay, I guess there is no question, I feel. Am I right? Welcome. Hi, Ezgi. But we are finishing. But okay.
All right.
So, Meki, I guess if there's no more question, I'm really, really glad to hear, and I love to listen to you. So I want to share more topics and research questions, etc., but not now because I don't want too much time. But we can email to you and we can have some Zoom meeting. So somebody's writing, oh, but okay, she's saying thank you. So I'm going to finish if there is no more question. Thank you for accepting our invitation again. So that is it, I guess. Mücahit. Okay, she's clapping. Okay. So,
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. It was delightful to be with you today.
thank you.
I look forward to further conversations.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye for everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Ya çok pardon Bengü, ben vallahi zamanları karıştırdım. Bizden katılan olur mu bilmiyorum. Gerçi
Aa.
biz çok toplar var bu öğleden sonra.
Olsun olsun. Ama yani çok güzeldi Ezgi. Keşke katılsaydın. Ya benim çok iyiydi yani. Hani kaçırdığın için üzüldüm ama dinleyebilirsin. Gönderebiliriz galiba dinlemek istersen.
Ben zamanları karıştırdım. Hatta ben anonsa da yanlış yazdım. Ben bundan sonra...
Aa, neyse.
Şu anda sizde saat
8.
8. 3 saat fark var tabii. Neyse.
Ya orada neyse artık.
Pardon.
Yok. Tamam peki. Herkese katılım için çok teşekkür ederim Ezgi. Sana da teşekkür ederim.
Görüşmek üzere.
Gel bir sonrakine. Görüşmek üzere. Bay bay. Bay bay. Emrullah teşekkür ediyorum tekrardan.
Görüşmek üzere hocam.
İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar diliyorum.
Katılım için sağ olun. Bay bay.